There are fortunes that glitter untouched, and there are fortunes that glow only after they have been broken, repaired, and held close to the fire of loss. Come closer. Imagine a quiet room lit by a single flame, the kind that breathes slowly, casting long shadows on wood and paper. In that room, a bowl lies in pieces on a low table. Not an ordinary bowl, but one that once passed from hand to hand in the stillness of a Japanese tea ceremony. When it shattered, it did not scream. It simply accepted gravity. Later, someone patient enough gathered every fragment, traced every fracture, and filled those wounds with gold. The cracks were not erased. They were honored. This is not a story about beauty. It is a story about survival. Across centuries and continents, men and women have learned the same lesson through harsher materials than clay. They learned it through ruined ledgers, burned ships, seized estates, and nights when sleep would not come because the numbers no longer added up. History remembers their victories, but it whispers about their fractures. The moments when their wealth failed them, the moments when they failed themselves, and the moments, far rarer, when they returned wiser, slower, and strangely stronger. In finance, we are taught to hide our mistakes, to smooth the surface, to pretend the bowl was never dropped. But time does not reward those who deny the break. It rewards those who study it, reinforce it, and allow it to change the shape of their hands. Tonight, by this fire, we will speak of broken fortunes and golden repairs, not to glorify loss, but to extract its meaning. If this journey resonates with you, take a quiet moment to like this video, subscribe to the Echoes of Wealth channel, or support this work in whatever way feels right. Your presence here already tells me you understand something most do not. Most people believe wealth is something you build upward, brick by brick, year after year, until one day you stand safely above the chaos below. History knows better. History knows that wealth is more often built downward, through collapse, through humiliation, through nights when a man stares at the ceiling and realizes that everything he trusted has cracked at once. Not gently, not symbolically, but violently, publicly, and without mercy. There is a moment, common to emperors, merchants, bankers, and artisans alike, when loss stops being abstract. It is no longer a percentage on a ledger or a headline in a newspaper. It becomes physical. The stomach tightens. The room feels smaller. The future, once wide and inviting, narrows into a thin corridor with no obvious exit. In that moment, a person learns whether their wealth was substance or decoration. We like to tell stories of success as if they move in straight lines. Education, effort, discipline, reward. But if you follow the real lives of those whose names still echo centuries later, the lines are jagged. Fortunes are made, erased, rebuilt, and reshaped. The first fortune is often the weakest. It has no memory of pain. The second, if it comes at all, carries scars like a map. In Japan, there is an old understanding that an object which has never been broken is unfinished. It has not yet been tested by reality. When a ceramic bowl shatters, it reveals its true structure, its weak points, its hidden tensions. And when it is repaired with gold, the bowl becomes something new, not restored to what it was, but transformed into what it could not have been without the fall. Human lives follow the same pattern. So do financial lives. The modern world teaches us to fear visible damage, to erase failure from resumes, to bury bankruptcies, to pretend that a bad decade never happened. But markets remember. Cycles repeat. Crises return wearing different masks. And those who have never lived through loss mistake confidence for competence. This is why the most dangerous investor is not the poor one, but the unbroken one. Tonight, we will not celebrate recklessness, nor romanticize ruin. We will do something more uncomfortable. We will study failure as a teacher. We will examine the men who lost everything and returned not louder, not flashier, but more durable. We will trace how collapse refines judgment, sharpens instinct, and strips away illusions that no book can remove. This is not motivation. It is initiation. Because once you understand this truth, you cannot unsee it. That wealth which has never been cracked will crack eventually. And wealth that survives cracking becomes something else entirely. Heavier, quieter, more patient. By the end of this journey, you will no longer ask how to avoid loss at all costs. You will ask a better question: how to ensure that when loss arrives, it leaves you stronger than it found you. Sit with me by the fire. Let the noise of the world fade. We begin where most stories of wealth refuse to start. We begin after the break. The first thing people noticed during the panic of 1907 was the sound. It was not shouting, not at first. It was the low murmur of uncertainty, the rustle of shoes on pavement before dawn, the repeated clearing of throats as men stood in lines they had never imagined joining. New York, a city trained to move quickly, had slowed into a nervous shuffle. Banks are temples of confidence. They look solid so that doubt does not enter the mind. Marble floors, tall columns, brass handles polished by thousands of hands. But confidence is not stone. It is breath. And in October of that year, the breath was leaving the room. John Pierpont Morgan watched all of this from a distance, not from a bank counter or a trading floor, but from his library. The room smelled of leather bindings and smoke. Lamps cast a warm, steady light that did not flicker, even as the financial system outside began to do exactly that. Morgan was 70 years old. His body was heavy. His face carried the marks of long dinners, long arguments, long wars fought with numbers instead of weapons. He did not rush to the window. He did not ask for updates every minute. He had seen this rhythm before. Years earlier, as a younger man, Morgan had learned a lesson most financiers learn too late. Markets do not collapse because numbers are wrong. They collapse because belief disappears. A balance sheet can be solvent and still die if trust withdraws. His father had taught him this in quieter times, during smaller failures, when the cost of learning was survivable. As a boy, Morgan was sickly. He spent long periods isolated, reading, observing, forced into stillness while others moved. This early confinement shaped him. He learned patience before he learned ambition. He learned to watch faces before watching prices. When he entered finance, he did not chase opportunity the way others did. He circled it, tested it, waited for its weak points to reveal themselves. In the decades leading up to 1907, America had grown drunk on expansion. Railroads stretched across the continent like veins, carrying steel, coal, and optimism. Speculators promised returns that defied gravity. Trust companies, lightly regulated and heavily confident, multiplied. Everyone believed the future would arrive faster than the past ever had. Morgan did not share their enthusiasm. He had witnessed the railroad panics of the 1870s and 1890s. He had seen empires built on borrowed confidence and collapse under their own weight. Where others saw speed, he saw fragility. Where others chased growth, he demanded structure. This made him enemies. It also made him indispensable. When the panic finally ignited, it did not begin with Morgan. It began with speculation gone wrong, with a failed attempt to corner the market on United Copper. The details mattered less than the effect. Fear spread. Trust companies faced runs. One institution's weakness exposed another's. Each withdrawal became a vote of no confidence in the entire system. Men who had spoken boldly weeks earlier now whispered. Deals evaporated. Credit froze. And then the unthinkable happened. The question stopped being who would fail next. It became whether the system itself could survive. There was no central bank to intervene. No authority with the mandate or speed to act. The government hesitated, unsure of its own reach. In that vacuum, the financial world did something ancient and instinctive. It turned to the elder. Morgan sent word. Bankers, trust executives, and industrialists arrived at his home one by one, some reluctantly, some desperately. They entered a room that felt more like a monastery than a command center. Heavy chairs, thick carpets, silence punctuated by the scratch of pens and the strike of matches. Morgan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with precision. He demanded numbers, not projections, not assurances. Numbers as they were, not as men wished them to be. Weak institutions were identified quickly. There would be no pretending they could all be saved. This was the first crack many of them experienced. The realization that survival required sacrifice. That reputation alone would not hold back the tide. Morgan locked the doors. It is easy to misunderstand this moment, to imagine it as theatrical dominance. In truth, it was necessity. Panic feeds on delay. He forced decisions because indecision was already killing the system. Capital was pooled. Support was extended selectively. Some firms were allowed to fall so others could stand. Outside, the public never saw the arguments, the exhaustion, the grudging concessions. They saw only that the collapse slowed, that banks reopened, that life continued. Inside, something else happened. Morgan himself was not untouched by this crisis. He risked his own capital, his own reputation. He carried the weight of knowing that failure here would not be personal. It would be historical. Yet he did not flinch, not because he was fearless, but because fear was familiar to him. He had met it before, in earlier cycles, when his name was not yet carved into the architecture of finance. This is where Kintsugi begins. Morgan's authority in 1907 did not come from wealth alone. Many men were wealthy. It came from memory, from scars earned in earlier downturns, from the discipline of not chasing every rising tide. His financial life had fractures, but those fractures had been reinforced with understanding. The market does not reward brilliance in calm seas. It reveals character in storms. As the panic subsided, Morgan emerged as a symbol of stability. Yet something subtle had changed. The system had been broken and repaired, but the cracks remained visible to those who knew where to look. And Morgan, perhaps more than anyone, understood that this would not be the last time. Wealth that survives collapse is never the same. It carries weight. It moves slower. It listens longer. This is only the beginning. When the doors of Morgan's library finally opened, the crisis had not vanished. Panic never disappears all at once. It recedes like a tide, leaving wreckage behind. Trust companies were ruined. Fortunes dissolved quietly, without ceremony. Men who had been certain of their place in the world found themselves unmoored, forced to explain losses to families who had never imagined such explanations would be necessary. Morgan understood something in those days that most did not. The crisis was not an interruption. It was a revelation. In private, he spoke of finance not as a machine, but as a living organism. Living systems, he believed, do not grow without stress. They strengthen where pressure is applied correctly and fail where weakness is ignored. The panic of 1907 was not an accident. It was a test the system had been postponing for years. What few people know is that Morgan's own firm had nearly failed decades earlier, during the Panic of 1873. He was younger then, less revered, still proving himself. Railroads collapsed under speculative excess. Credit vanished overnight. Morgan survived not because he was untouched, but because he had positioned himself conservatively while others indulged in fantasy. That survival burned a lesson into him that never faded. Excess optimism is the most expensive luxury in finance. By 1907, this memory shaped every decision he made. When others begged for blanket rescues, Morgan refused. Rescue without discipline only plants the seeds of a larger disaster. He insisted that institutions seeking support reveal their books fully. Some refused. They failed. Others complied. They lived, changed forever by the humiliation of exposure. There were rumors, whispered in hallways and printed cautiously in papers, that Morgan enjoyed this power, that he relished deciding who would survive. Those who knew him better understood something quieter and darker. He was haunted by the knowledge that unchecked collapse would destroy not just capital, but faith itself. And once faith is gone, rebuilding takes generations. At night, after the meetings ended and the house grew still, Morgan did not sleep easily. His health was fragile. His breathing labored. The weight of the system pressed on him in ways no balance sheet could capture. But he did not retreat. He never retreated when the structure itself was at risk. This is where the philosophy beneath Kintsugi reveals itself. When a bowl breaks, the craftsman does not rush to seal it. He studies the fracture. He traces each line with care, understanding where the stress traveled, where the clay resisted, where it surrendered. To rush repair without understanding is to guarantee another break. Morgan treated the American financial system the same way. The panic exposed structural weaknesses. Trust companies had grown too quickly. Oversight was thin. Liquidity was treated as an afterthought. These were not mistakes of intelligence. They were mistakes of character, overconfidence, impatience, forgetting that cycles always return. In the months following the crisis, Morgan became a reluctant advocate for reform. He supported the idea of a central banking system, not because he desired less responsibility, but because he understood that no individual, however capable, should be forced to serve as the final backstop of a nation's economy. The cracks had shown where reinforcement was needed. This is the financial lesson that matters most for you. Recovery is not about restoring what was lost. It is about redesigning how you engage with risk. Those who rebuild their portfolios exactly as before are not healed. They are patched. They mistake gold paint for gold lacquer. Morgan's fortune grew after 1907, but not in the way people imagine. He became more selective, more patient. His deals fewer, but heavier. He valued stability over spectacle, compounding over conquest. His scars guided him. This is why second fortunes, when they exist, tend to outperform first fortunes. The first is built on optimism. The second is built on memory. If you have lived through loss, you carry an advantage that cannot be taught. You know what leverage feels like when it turns against you. You know how quickly confidence evaporates. You know the sound of silence when the market closes and your assumptions fail to answer back. The mistake is to numb that memory, to rush into forgetting, to seek redemption through speed. Kintsugi wealth demands the opposite. It asks you to slow down, to examine the break, to honor it. Morgan did not emerge from 1907 louder. He emerged quieter, heavier with understanding. His power was no longer just financial. It was psychological. People trusted him because he had survived what they feared. Markets sense this. Capital flows toward those who remain steady under pressure. As the years passed, the panic of 1907 faded from headlines, but its lesson embedded itself into the architecture of modern finance. The Federal Reserve was born. Oversight increased. Memory became institutionalized. For Morgan, the crisis confirmed something he had suspected all along. That true wealth is not what grows fastest, but what survives stress without losing its shape. The fire had burned. The bowl had shattered. And gold now traced the lines no one could ignore. Long after the panic receded from public memory, Morgan continued to replay it in his mind, not as a victory, but as a warning. He understood that the most dangerous moment in finance is not collapse itself. It is the moment immediately after, when survival masquerades as proof of invincibility. In private correspondence, Morgan spoke less about money and more about temperament. He believed that the true test of a financier was not how aggressively he could pursue opportunity, but how calmly he could endure deprivation. This belief was forged not in libraries, but in earlier seasons of embarrassment and doubt, when deals failed and reputations trembled. Those seasons were never discussed at banquets. But they shaped everything. Morgan had a habit, almost monastic, of reviewing old failures. He kept records not only of profits, but of mistakes. He studied them the way a general studies lost battles, not to relive shame, but to map the terrain of human error, overextension, confirmation bias, the intoxicating pull of crowds. He recognized these forces not as external threats, but as internal weaknesses. This is where most people misunderstand financial recovery. They focus on repairing capital, but neglect to repair judgment. They treat loss as a technical error rather than a psychological one. Morgan knew better. He believed that without reshaping the mind, money would simply find a new way to escape. After 1907, many institutions returned to business as usual as quickly as possible. Morgan did not. He slowed his firm deliberately. He rejected deals that would have made him richer in the short term. When asked why, he responded simply that he had already learned what impatience costs. His memory of earlier panics was still warm. There were rumors, too, less flattering ones. Whispers that Morgan used crises to consolidate power, that he allowed certain firms to fail so he could acquire their remnants cheaply. History is rarely clean. Power and necessity often overlap. But even his critics acknowledged one fact. When Morgan intervened, chaos diminished. Markets stabilized. Trust returned, however reluctantly. This duality is uncomfortable, and it should be. Kintsugi is not moral decoration. It does not pretend the break was beautiful while it was happening. It acknowledges pain without romanticizing it. The gold appears later. The spiritual lesson beneath this chapter is not optimism. It is acceptance. Wabi-sabi teaches that impermanence is not a flaw in the universe. It is the rule. Morgan operated as if collapse was not an anomaly, but an expectation. He prepared for it not with fear, but with respect. Respect changes behavior. In financial terms, this meant liquidity held longer than seemed necessary. It meant leverage used sparingly. It meant trusting fewer voices, but listening more deeply. Morgan understood that markets punish those who confuse intelligence with immunity. For those rebuilding after financial loss, this lesson is vital. Your instinct may be to recover quickly, to erase the memory, to prove that you are still capable. That instinct is understandable. It is also dangerous. Speed feels like healing, but often it is avoidance. True recovery is slower. It requires sitting with discomfort long enough to extract wisdom. It requires asking questions you avoided before the fall. Why did I believe that risk was smaller than it was? Why did I ignore warning signs? Why did I equate movement with progress? Morgan asked these questions relentlessly. He did not share the answers publicly, but they shaped the architecture of his decisions. By the time he reached the final years of his life, Morgan was no longer chasing expansion. He was preserving coherence. His wealth became quieter, more concentrated, less visible. He trusted fewer people with larger responsibilities. His system was smaller, but stronger. This is the paradox of Kintsugi wealth. As the cracks become visible, the structure becomes more honest. What survives is not everything, but what matters. The market does not care how confident you sound. It cares how you behave under stress. It does not reward explanations. It rewards endurance. Morgan's legacy is often reduced to numbers, to influence, to architecture. But his true inheritance is psychological. A reminder that wealth without memory is brittle, and memory without reflection is wasted. If you have been broken financially, you are not behind. You are initiated. If you allow the fracture to teach you, you are already working with gold. The fire has not finished its work yet. As Morgan aged, those closest to him noticed a shift that rarely appears in biographies. His appetite for control softened, replaced by a deeper concern for continuity. He spoke less about dominance and more about stewardship. The system, he believed, had to outlive its strongest figures, or it was already broken. In the final years after the panic, Morgan withdrew from public spectacle. He delegated more. He trusted structures over personalities. This was not retreat. It was refinement. He had learned that a system dependent on one man, no matter how capable, was fragile by design. There is a quiet irony here. The man who saved the system in 1907 spent the remainder of his life trying to ensure that such salvation would never again require a single human will. The gold in the cracks was not meant to glorify him. It was meant to strengthen the vessel. This is where financial philosophy meets humility. Most people rebuild their financial lives by clinging more tightly to control. They micromanage portfolios. They monitor prices obsessively. They seek certainty where none exists. Morgan moved in the opposite direction. He designed buffers. He accepted uncertainty. He trusted time more than force. Wabi-sabi teaches that perfection is lifeless. Morgan's later strategies reflected this understanding. He allowed inefficiencies. He tolerated redundancy. He built slack into his system, knowing that slack absorbs shock. In practical terms, this meant maintaining cash even when returns looked attractive elsewhere. It meant refusing leverage that promised speed at the cost of stability. It meant favoring enterprises that could endure droughts, not just thrive in sunshine. These decisions made him appear old-fashioned to younger financiers. They chased innovation and scale. Morgan chose durability. The difference became visible during later market tremors. Those who had rebuilt quickly found themselves exposed again. Those who had reinforced slowly remained standing. The lesson was not subtle, but it was easy to ignore during good times. This chapter of Morgan's life teaches something rarely discussed. Recovery is not a phase. It is a permanent adjustment. Once you have been broken, you do not return to innocence. You return to awareness. That awareness can become bitterness, or it can become wisdom. Morgan chose wisdom. He understood that every market cycle carries within it the seeds of the next collapse. The role of the investor is not to eliminate this reality, but to align with it, to build in a way that assumes stress will come. This is the heart of Kintsugi wealth. You do not hide the crack. You reinforce it. You let it guide your hand. In your own financial life, this may mean resisting the urge to prove yourself. It may mean reducing exposure rather than increasing it. It may mean choosing boring resilience over exciting fragility. Morgan's final years were marked by calm. He did not fear the next panic. He knew it would come, and he trusted that the system he had helped reshape would endure it better than the last. When he died in 1913, the world mourned a titan. But the deeper legacy lay elsewhere, in the quiet acceptance that wealth is not a monument. It is a process, one that must accommodate failure to remain alive. The house had burned down once. It would burn again someday. But now the foundations were different. The cracks were known. The gold had set. There is a detail from the final months of Morgan's life that rarely finds its way into financial textbooks. He no longer spoke much about returns. When younger men visited him, eager to impress, he asked different questions. How long can this endure? What happens when confidence leaves? Who bears the weight when things go wrong? These questions unsettled people. They were not the language of expansion. They were the language of survival. Morgan understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone of his era, that wealth is not owned. It is borrowed from time, and time always charges interest. In the years after the panic of 1907, the American financial system appeared stronger, more coordinated, more confident. But Morgan did not confuse appearance with reality. He knew that strength was provisional, that vigilance, not optimism, was the true guardian of capital. He once remarked to a close associate that the greatest danger to a man of means is forgetting the sound of loss. Not the pain, but the sound. The silence after the phones stop ringing. The absence of reassurance. The hollow echo of one's own thoughts when markets no longer respond. That sound, he believed, should never be forgotten. This is why Kintsugi is not merely an aesthetic philosophy. It is a discipline of memory. When a bowl is repaired with gold, it does not pretend it was never broken. Each time it is lifted, the crack catches the light. It reminds the holder of fragility, of gravity, of care. The object demands respect, not fear, but attentiveness. Morgan treated wealth the same way after the fire. He handled it more deliberately. He moved it less often. He asked more of it before trusting it. His fortune became something to steward, not something to display. For those listening now, especially those who have tasted financial ruin or near ruin, this matters deeply. You may feel behind. You may feel marked. You may feel as though others are moving ahead while you are still studying the wreckage. But history does not reward speed alone. It rewards adaptation. If you rebuild without reflection, you rebuild weakness. If you rebuild with humility, you rebuild strength. The market cannot distinguish between arrogance and confidence in calm times. It distinguishes brutally when pressure returns. Morgan's second act was quieter than his first, but it was heavier with meaning. He did not seek to dominate the future. He sought to remain standing within it. This is a far more difficult ambition. The true measure of wealth is not how high it rises in a favorable season. It is how little it shatters when the season turns. Kintsugi wealth accepts that loss will come. It plans for it. It learns from it. It integrates it. The scar becomes structure. The memory becomes strategy. If your financial life has been cracked, do not rush to hide it. Study it. Reinforce it. Let it change how you think, how you wait, how you choose risk. The gold is not added from outside. It is revealed by attention. Morgan did not escape history. He engaged with it honestly. And because of that, his influence outlived his body. Systems he helped shape endured storms he would never see. The house burned down. The fire was real. The fear was real. But what rose afterward was not a replica of the past. It was something denser, more intentional, less naive. That is the promise of Kintsugi wealth. Not invulnerability, but resilience with memory. This chapter closes here, not with triumph, but with steadiness. The kind that remains when applause fades and markets grow quiet again. The rain that morning was thin and cold, the kind that seeps through cloth without announcing itself. It clung to the dirt roads of early 17th century Japan and softened the outlines of the mountains, as if the world itself were hesitating to be seen. A lone figure walked steadily through it, unhurried, carrying no banner, no visible wealth, no steel at his side. This was Miyamoto Musashi, and by the standards of his time, he looked like a man who had already lost. Japan was emerging from centuries of civil war. The great battles were over, but the scars were everywhere. Samurai who had once lived by the sword now found themselves without masters, without stipends, without purpose. Status was dissolving. Old hierarchies were cracking. Many clung desperately to appearances. Musashi did not. He had been born into violence. His first duel, according to surviving accounts, came when he was barely a teenager. By the time most men were learning obedience, Musashi had already learned death. He wandered from province to province, challenging other swordsmen not for money or rank, but for understanding. Victory after victory followed. His name spread. His reputation hardened. And yet, there came a moment when Musashi began to abandon the very symbols that had made him feared. He stopped polishing his armor. He dressed poorly. He slept outdoors. He carried a wooden sword instead of steel, sometimes carving it himself from tree branches along the road. To outsiders, this looked like decline. To Musashi, it was refinement. The myth most people know ends with his undefeated record. But the deeper story lies in what he chose to let go of along the way. In one famous duel against Sasaki Kojiro, Musashi arrived late on purpose. He carved his weapon from an oar while crossing to the island. When the fight ended, Kojiro lay dead, and Musashi walked away carrying nothing but a crude piece of wood. The message was unmistakable. The weapon was never the source of power. What history rarely emphasizes is what followed. Musashi did not capitalize on fame. He did not sell his reputation to a lord. He did not build an estate. Instead, he retreated. He painted. He wrote. He lived with monks. He starved at times. He studied emptiness. This is where the cracks appear. Musashi had seen countless warriors ruined not by defeat, but by attachment. Attachment to status. Attachment to tools. Attachment to the illusion that what they carried was what made them dangerous. He chose a different path. He stripped himself down until only skill remained. From a financial perspective, this is profoundly uncomfortable. Most people define wealth by what they possess. Musashi defined strength by what he could lose without changing who he was. His wooden sword was not a gimmick. It was a declaration. If you need perfect conditions to succeed, you are already fragile. In later years, Musashi wrote of strategy not as aggression, but as alignment. He warned against excess, against fixation, against mistaking momentum for mastery. His philosophy was forged not in victory, but in deliberate deprivation. This is the first lesson of Kintsugi in this chapter. Before repair comes removal. Before gold fills the cracks, unnecessary weight must be shed. Spiritually, this aligns with the Japanese understanding of impermanence. Wabi-sabi does not celebrate decay for its own sake. It recognizes that clinging to form is the root of suffering. Musashi lived this truth with ruthless honesty. When he finally settled in a cave to write his Book of Five Rings, he was no longer a duelist chasing opponents. He was a man distilling experience. He had lost youth. He had lost comfort. He had lost the security of belonging. What remained was clarity. For those rebuilding after financial loss, this stage is unavoidable. The urge is to replace what was lost as quickly as possible, to regain symbols, to prove survival through accumulation. Musashi's life suggests a different order. First, ensure that what remains is real. If your wealth vanished tomorrow, what would still function? Your skills, your judgment, your discipline, your patience. These are wooden swords, unglamorous, often mocked, but they do not break easily. Musashi did not fear being underestimated. He cultivated it. In markets, this is a rare advantage. Those who have lost visible wealth often gain invisible strength if they allow the process to complete. This chapter will go further into the philosophy Musashi extracted from hardship and into the financial implications of building wealth that does not depend on appearances. But first, we sit with this image. A man walking through rain, carrying almost nothing, undefeated not because he had never lost, but because he had learned what he could afford to lose. As Musashi grew older, the battles that mattered most no longer took place on riverbanks or narrow bridges. They took place in the mind. Victory was no longer measured by fallen opponents, but by freedom from dependence. He began to speak of emptiness, not as absence, but as space. Space to see clearly. Space to move without hesitation. Space to act without being pulled off balance by desire or fear. This idea unsettled those who still believed mastery was a matter of accumulation. More techniques, more weapons, more recognition. Musashi rejected that path deliberately. He wrote that the way was not found in excess refinement. Too much polish dulled awareness. Too much comfort softened instinct. A warrior, he believed, must remain close to uncertainty, not as a thrill, but as a teacher. This was not asceticism for display. It was calibration. The philosophy beneath his choices aligns closely with wabi-sabi. Imperfection reveals truth. Simplicity reveals strength. When nothing extraneous remains, reality becomes impossible to ignore. Musashi's wooden sword was an imperfect tool. It chipped. It splintered. It absorbed impact differently than steel. And because of that, it forced him to adapt constantly. Each fight became a conversation with reality rather than a rehearsal of form. His skill deepened because his tools refused to compensate for him. This is the hidden danger of financial recovery done poorly. New wealth can become a shield that prevents growth. It insulates you from consequences, numbs feedback, and encourages the belief that structure alone will protect you. Musashi would have recognized this immediately. He warned against dependence on any single method. He urged practitioners to learn multiple disciplines, not to display versatility, but to avoid rigidity. Rigidity, in his view, was death. The moment you believe your way is the only way, you stop adapting. And the world does not stop moving for you. Translating this into financial life requires honesty. If you rebuild your wealth using the exact same assumptions that failed you before, you have learned nothing. The form may look different, but the structure is identical. You are carrying steel again, trusting it to do the work your judgment should be doing. Musashi's emptiness teaches something subtler. Build skills that function across conditions. Learn to operate without perfect information. Practice restraint. Practice waiting. Practice humility when conditions change. He believed timing mattered more than force. That entering too early or too late revealed misunderstanding, not misfortune. In markets, this insight is invaluable. Impatience destroys more capital than ignorance ever could. Musashi's later life was not glamorous. He lived on the margins. He painted scenes of birds and landscapes, studying balance and movement. He observed how water flowed around obstacles rather than confronting them. These were not hobbies. They were extensions of strategy. The spiritual core of his teaching was alignment. When your inner state is stable, external chaos loses its power over you. This is why he valued detachment, not because he rejected the world, but because he refused to be ruled by it. For those who have experienced financial loss, detachment is often misunderstood. It is not indifference. It is clarity. It allows you to see risk without flinching and opportunity without grasping. Musashi's life suggests that recovery is not about reclaiming dominance. It is about reclaiming agency. Agency comes from knowing that you can function with less, adapt to more, and remain intact when conditions shift. This is Kintsugi at the level of the self. Before gold is added, the bowl must hold together. Before wealth compounds, judgment must stabilize. Musashi did not leave behind estates or dynasties. He left behind a way of seeing, one that prizes resilience over display, adaptability over rigidity, and presence over possession. In the next movement of this chapter, we will take these principles and ground them firmly in financial reality. How to build a portfolio that functions like a wooden sword. How to recover from loss without recreating fragility. How to let emptiness become an advantage rather than a wound. For now, remember this. The samurai who walks without a sword is not defenseless. He is unburdened. Do you want me to continue the next part? When Musashi finally settled into stillness, when the wandering slowed and the duels faded into memory, what remained was not regret, but structure. His life had stripped him down to principles that could not be taken from him. This is where the financial meaning of his path becomes unmistakable. Most people think resilience comes from accumulation. More assets, more streams, more leverage. Musashi's life argues the opposite. Resilience comes from non-dependence. The fewer conditions required for you to function, the harder it is for the world to break you. In finance, this principle is quietly radical. A portfolio built like a steel sword performs beautifully under ideal conditions. It is sharp, precise, optimized. But steel demands care. It rusts. It snaps under the wrong stress. It assumes the wielder will always have room to swing. A wooden sword is different. It is heavier in the hand, less elegant. It does not promise perfection, but it absorbs shock. It functions in cramped spaces. It forces the user to rely on timing, distance, and judgment rather than brute force. Financially, a wooden sword portfolio prioritizes survival over spectacle. This means liquidity is not an afterthought. Cash is not wasted potential. It is space. Space to wait. Space to move when others are frozen. Space to absorb mistakes without being destroyed by them. Musashi's emptiness becomes your margin of safety. It also means skill development is treated as capital. The ability to analyze, to read cycles, to manage emotion under pressure, to understand multiple asset classes rather than worship one. These are portable. They do not vanish when markets turn. They compound invisibly. Many who recover from loss rush toward complexity. New strategies, new instruments, new narratives. Musashi would caution restraint. Complexity often hides fragility. Simplicity exposes truth. If you cannot explain why an investment works in plain language, you are probably leaning on the tool rather than your understanding. There is also the question of identity. After loss, people often rebuild their wealth to repair their self-image. They chase validation through numbers. This is dangerous. It creates emotional leverage. When markets move against you, they are no longer challenging your strategy. They are challenging your worth. Musashi avoided this trap by divorcing identity from outcome. He was not undefeated because he won every duel. He was undefeated because defeat could not define him. His sense of self did not depend on applause. In practical terms, this translates into position sizing and risk tolerance. You never place so much of your capital or ego into a single idea that its failure destabilizes you. You respect uncertainty enough to limit exposure. You accept that not every move needs to prove something. This is where patience becomes an asset. Musashi emphasized waiting for the right moment, not because he feared action, but because he respected timing. In markets, waiting is not inactivity. It is discipline. It is the refusal to swing when the distance is wrong. Most losses come not from ignorance, but from premature action. Entering before clarity. Exiting before understanding. Reacting to noise. A wooden sword investor moves less, but moves decisively. There is another layer to this philosophy that rarely gets discussed. Musashi lived simply not because he rejected wealth, but because simplicity protected his autonomy. He could walk away from situations that compromised him. He could refuse patrons. He could choose solitude over obligation. Financial independence, in its purest form, is not about luxury. It is about optionality, the ability to say no, to step back, to wait, to choose alignment over urgency. If you have lost wealth, you may feel that optionality has been taken from you. Musashi's life suggests it can be rebuilt from the inside out. First through discipline, then through skill, then through capital. Kintsugi wealth does not rush to look impressive. It reinforces the cracks first. It builds a structure that can function without ornament. When Musashi died, he left behind no fortune in the conventional sense. Yet his influence persists centuries later because it was not dependent on circumstance. His strategy outlived his body. That is the ultimate test of wealth. Not how much you control, but how little you need to remain whole. As you move forward, consider this question quietly. If everything familiar were taken from you, what would remain functional? That answer is your wooden sword. In the next chapter, we will meet another figure who learned this lesson not through voluntary simplicity, but through catastrophe imposed from above. An emperor whose power could not protect him from loss, and whose philosophy was forged under pressure he did not choose. Before he was an emperor, before his name was etched into marble and memory, Marcus Aurelius was a boy taught to prepare for loss as others were taught to pursue pleasure. His tutors noticed it early, a seriousness that did not come from melancholy, but from awareness. While other children played at dominance, Marcus practiced restraint. He was born into privilege, but not illusion. Rome at its height was already rotting quietly beneath its gold. Expansion had stretched the empire thin. Luxury softened discipline. Power attracted flatterers faster than truth. Marcus saw this long before he wore the purple. When he finally ascended the throne, he did not inherit peace. He inherited fracture. Plague swept through the empire, emptying cities and fields. Borders trembled under barbarian pressure. Generals betrayed him. Trusted advisors failed. The treasury strained. Rome, which had trained its rulers to project invincibility, now demanded endurance. Marcus did not pretend this was temporary. At night, alone in military tents far from the capital, he wrote not speeches, but reminders to himself. Lines that were never meant to be published. thoughts meant to steady a mind surrounded by decay. These writings would later be called meditations, but they were not philosophy in the abstract. They were survival notes. Here is the crack most histories rush past. Marcus Aurelius did not rule from strength. He ruled from depletion. He buried children. He watched provinces burn. He approved tax increases that angered citizens already suffering. He sold imperial possessions to fund campaigns. Statues, jewelry, symbols of power reduced to currency. An emperor liquidating himself to keep the structure alive. From the outside, this looked like failure. From the inside, it was alignment with reality. Marcus understood something fundamental. Power does not prevent loss. It only changes the scale at which loss arrives. The higher you stand, the further there is to fall. His philosophy was not optimism. It was consent. He wrote that you must love whatever happens to you, because it was shaped for you by the same universe that shaped your mind. This was not comfort. It was armor. Spiritually, this reflects the deepest layer of wabi-sabi. Impermanence is not an exception to be managed. It is the fabric of existence. Marcus did not fight this truth. He integrated it. This is where his relevance to financial recovery becomes unavoidable. Most people encounter loss and immediately seek escape. They distract. They deny. They rage. Marcus did none of these. He sat with loss long enough for it to teach him proportion. What mattered? What did not? What could be controlled? What never could? He did not confuse acceptance with passivity. He acted constantly. Campaigns were planned. Borders reinforced. Reforms attempted. But his actions were stripped of illusion. He no longer expected permanence from success. This mental shift changes everything. In finance, many losses hurt not because of their size, but because of the expectations attached to them. The belief that things should have gone differently. That success was owed. That progress was guaranteed. Marcus dismantled this belief at its root. He trained himself to expect disruption, to view stability as temporary, to treat gains as loans from fate rather than personal triumphs. This made him slower to celebrate and faster to adapt. The emperor who failed first did not fail last. His early recognition of fragility gave him a resilience that outlasted stronger, louder rulers. Rome did not collapse on his watch, not because he prevented decay, but because he managed it honestly. Kintsugi wealth begins here, with the refusal to lie to oneself. Marcus did not hide the cracks of empire. He wrote directly to them. He let them reshape his priorities. He allowed loss to refine rather than embitter him. As this chapter unfolds, we will move deeper into the philosophy that sustained him, and then into the financial lessons that emerge when power, wealth, and certainty all prove insufficient. For now, sit with this image. An emperor in a tent, candle flickering, writing not about victory, but about how to remain human when everything familiar is breaking. Marcus Aurelius never wrote about winning the future. He wrote about surviving the present without becoming corrupted by it. This distinction matters more than it appears. As the years of his reign passed, Marcus lived almost constantly on campaign. The Danube frontier became his home. Mud replaced marble. Cold replaced comfort. The Emperor of Rome slept among soldiers who would never see Rome's splendor, men who knew hunger and fear more intimately than ceremony. He chose this life deliberately, not as punishment, but as grounding. Loss followed him there as well. The Antonine Plague did not respect rank. It hollowed out legions. It emptied towns. It reduced tax revenue and strained supply lines. Marcus watched an empire built on abundance confront scarcity, and instead of pretending otherwise, he adjusted. He reduced expenditures. He reorganized logistics. He accepted that contraction was not collapse. It was adaptation. This is where his philosophy deepens. Marcus believed that suffering becomes unbearable only when we add judgment to it. Pain, he argued, is data. It tells you something about reality. It becomes torment only when you insist it should not exist. This is not resignation. It is clarity. He trained his mind to separate events from interpretations. The loss of money is an event. The belief that this loss defines your worth is an interpretation. One can be changed. The other must be unlearned. Financially, this insight is transformative. Most people experience market loss as personal failure. Their identity fuses with outcomes. When prices fall, self-respect falls with them. Marcus refused this fusion. He reminded himself daily that reputation, wealth, and comfort are externals, useful, but not sovereign. This allowed him to make decisions others could not. When the treasury ran low, he did not debase the currency recklessly. He did not inflate illusions to preserve appearances. He chose transparency. He sold imperial assets publicly, signaling that even the emperor would sacrifice symbols to preserve function. This act stabilized confidence more than denial ever could. In markets, credibility works the same way. Investors trust those who acknowledge reality more than those who disguise it. Loss admitted early costs less than loss hidden until it metastasizes. Marcus also understood time differently. He wrote often about the shortness of life, not to induce despair, but to discipline urgency. When time is finite, revenge trading becomes absurd. Ego-driven decisions lose their appeal. Long-term thinking becomes natural. This temporal awareness is missing in most financial behavior. People panic because they compress time. A drawdown becomes a catastrophe because it is treated as permanent. Marcus expanded time. He viewed setbacks as brief episodes within a larger arc. This is not naive optimism. It is statistical humility. Empires rise and fall. So do markets. Individual fortunes fluctuate within cycles that dwarf personal timelines. Marcus aligned his expectations accordingly. He did not expect Rome to be eternal under his care. He expected to steward it responsibly for as long as he could. Kintsugi wealth adopts the same posture. You are not building an immortal structure. You are building something that can endure stress during your watch. Spiritually, this releases immense pressure. You no longer need every decision to be perfect. You need it to be honest. You need it to be proportionate. You need it to be grounded in what is, not what you wish were true. Marcus's meditations were never meant to inspire others. They were meant to restrain himself, to remind him that power amplifies error if left unchecked, that privilege invites delusion, that suffering is inevitable, but degradation is optional. For someone recovering financially, this distinction is critical. You cannot prevent all loss. You can prevent loss from deforming your character. You can prevent it from driving you into desperation or denial. You can allow it to refine patience, risk awareness, and emotional discipline. Marcus did not escape loss. He incorporated it. He allowed it to temper ambition into stewardship. In the next movement of this chapter, we will translate his stoic acceptance into precise financial behavior. How to design systems that assume volatility. How to size risk without fear. How to let impermanence become an ally rather than a threat. For now, remember this. The emperor who failed first survived longest because he stopped demanding guarantees from a world that never offered them. As Marcus Aurelius grew closer to the end of his life, something subtle happened to his relationship with power. He no longer treated it as something to expand or defend. He treated it as something to finish well. His body was failing. Illness followed him the way shadow follows form. The wars dragged on longer than planned. Victories were partial. Peace, when it came, felt provisional. And yet, those who observed him closely noticed an unusual calm, not relief, not resignation. Calm. Marcus had already lost the fantasy that power could save him. This is the final stage of his philosophy, and the most difficult one to accept. Once you truly understand impermanence, ambition changes shape. It becomes quieter, more precise, less hungry. He wrote that the universe is change, and life is opinion, not meaning that life is meaningless, but that suffering intensifies when we insist reality should obey our preferences. This belief freed him from the emotional whiplash that destroys leaders and investors alike. In financial life, most pain comes not from volatility, but from violated expectations. You expect growth. You expect stability. You expect fairness. Markets offer none of these consistently. Marcus would say the error lies not in the market, but in the expectation. He trained himself to treat every outcome as information rather than validation. Gains were signals, not proof of virtue. Losses were signals, not proof of failure. This detachment allowed him to continue governing rationally, even as conditions worsened. This is the gold poured into the crack. Kintsugi wealth does not promise protection from loss. It promises composure within it. That composure becomes a competitive advantage so profound it is often invisible to those who lack it. As Marcus aged, he increasingly emphasized duty over outcome. Do the work assigned to you. Act with justice. Accept the result. This mindset is deeply aligned with long-term investing and disciplined financial recovery. You focus on process rather than prediction. on allocation rather than excitement, on risk management rather than reward fantasy. You do not need certainty to act. You need integrity of method. This is why Stoic investors often appear boring. They do not chase narratives. They do not perform confidence. They do not panic when markets fall silent. Their decisions are slower, heavier, more considered. Marcus would recognize this immediately. He knew that drama feeds the ego, but starves wisdom. He warned against becoming addicted to emotional intensity, whether in pleasure or despair. Markets are skilled at exploiting addiction. They reward patience rarely, but punish impatience relentlessly. The emperor who failed first learned to fail without breaking. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, Rome did not collapse instantly, but something fragile was lost. A ruler who understood limits. A mind trained to accept decline without surrendering responsibility. His successor lacked this discipline, and history turned darker. This, too, is a financial lesson. Systems do not fail all at once. They weaken when memory is lost, when scars are forgotten, when the next generation inherits structure without understanding the stress that shaped it. If you recover financially and forget what loss taught you, you plant the seed of another collapse. If you remember, integrate, and adjust permanently, your wealth gains depth. Marcus never claimed victory over fate. He claimed alignment with it. That alignment allowed him to endure what would have destroyed louder men. Kintsugi wealth reaches maturity here, not when the crack disappears, but when it no longer frightens you. When you know how to hold the bowl carefully. When you trust your hands. The emperor wrote to himself so he would not forget who he needed to be when everything familiar was failing. You can do the same. Loss does not disqualify you from wealth. It qualifies you for a different kind of it. In the next chapter, we will meet a man who learned this lesson not through philosophy or discipline, but through betrayal and exile. A merchant whose empire vanished overnight, and whose recovery reveals the political fragility behind every fortune. For now, let this settle. The fire is lower, the night is quieter, and the mind, if you allow it, becomes steady enough to hold what remains. The ships did not sink in a storm. They did not burn in battle. They were taken quietly, by ink and seals, by whispered accusations carried through corridors of power. One season, the harbors of Marseille and Montpellier knew his name. The next, they avoided it. Jacques Coeur had built his fortune on movement. Goods from the Levant, silk, spices, silver. He understood routes before maps were reliable and risk before insurance existed. While others waited for permission, he negotiated. While others feared distance, he embraced it. By the middle of the 15th century, he was one of the richest men in France, financier to King Charles VII himself. His fleet was not just ships. It was trust made visible. Sailors depended on him. Cities depended on him. Even the crown depended on him. And that was the beginning of the crack. Power does not like mirrors. Jacques Coeur rose too quickly for a world that preferred inherited privilege. He was not born noble. He had no ancient lineage to soften envy. His wealth exposed an uncomfortable truth. Money, when combined with competence, could rival blood. The court smiled while it sharpened knives. When the accusations came, they were theatrical. Poisoning, sorcery, treason, charges chosen not for truth, but for resonance. The king he had funded did not defend him. Silence, in politics, is often the loudest betrayal. Kerr was arrested, his assets seized, his ships claimed by the very state he had helped stabilize, warehouses emptied, accounts frozen. The merchant prince was reduced to a prisoner, watching others divide the bones of his empire. This was not market loss. This was confiscation. A reminder that wealth exists only within the tolerance of power. From a distance, history often treats Kerr as a cautionary tale. Rise too fast. Trust power too much. But the deeper story begins after the fall. He escaped. Not dramatically, but determinedly. He fled France disguised, crossing borders with nothing but memory and skill. No fleet, no title, no protection. Just a man who had once coordinated continents, now navigating survival one decision at a time. Spiritually, this is where Kintsugi deepens. Wabi-sabi teaches that loss strips illusion. What breaks reveals what was never solid. Kerr learned that his wealth had been entangled with political favor more tightly than he admitted. The crack exposed dependence he had mistaken for stability, yet something essential remained. He still understood trade. He still understood human desire. He still understood logistics, negotiation, and timing. These were not seized. They could not be. In exile, Kerr rebuilt not an empire, but functionality. He served as an advisor, a coordinator, a mind for hire. His second life was smaller, quieter, and safer. He never returned to his former glory, but he did not disappear. This is the first financial lesson of his story. Wealth tied to a single system, jurisdiction, or patron carries invisible risk. It grows quickly, but it fractures catastrophically. Diversification is not only about assets, it is about power relationships. Kerr's initial fortune was vast, but concentrated. His recovery was modest, but resilient. Emotionally, this shift is brutal. It requires mourning not just money, but identity. He was no longer the man who moved kings. He became the man who survived them. Many who experience financial ruin resist this stage. They cling to the image of what they were. They seek restoration of status rather than reconstruction of capacity. Kerr did not have that luxury. Exile forces clarity. His story reminds us that the most dangerous risk is invisible dependence. When your wealth relies on favor rather than function, it is already cracked. As this chapter continues, we will move deeper into the philosophy of political risk, impermanence, and humility, and then into the financial strategies that allow recovery without recreating vulnerability. For now, sit with this image: a man watching his ships sail without him, not destroyed, but taken, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that true wealth must survive not only markets, but power itself. Exile changes the way a man hears silence. In France, Jacques Coeur had been surrounded by noise. Negotiations, petitions, celebrations, demands. Wealth creates sound. Its absence creates space. And in that space, the truth speaks more clearly. As he moved through foreign ports and unfamiliar courts, Coeur was forced to confront what his former life had allowed him to ignore. His first fortune had not failed because trade was flawed. It failed because power is jealous. Kings borrow money gladly, but they do not share authority easily. The moment a merchant appears indispensable, he becomes dangerous. This realization was not theoretical. It was lived. In Italy, and later in the Eastern Mediterranean, Coeur watched smaller merchants operate with an intelligence he had once dismissed as limitation. They stayed mobile. They trusted few. They kept assets light and influence distributed. Their profits were smaller, but their survival was not dependent on a single ruler's favor. The philosophy beneath this shift is older than commerce itself. Impermanence applies not only to objects, but to alliances. Wabi-sabi accepts that no structure remains intact forever. The error is not forming bonds. The error is forgetting they will eventually loosen. Coeur began to think in layers rather than towers. His earlier empire had been vertical. Everything flowed upward to him and outward from him. Power centralized. Decisions centralized. Visibility maximized. This made growth efficient and collapse absolute. In exile, he learned horizontality. Networks instead of empires. Relationships instead of dependence. Advisory roles instead of ownership. This did not restore his former wealth, but it restored agency. Financial recovery often demands this shift. After major loss, many attempt to rebuild the same structure at a smaller scale. They create a reduced version of the old empire, believing caution alone will protect them. But structure matters more than size. A fragile design remains fragile, even when downsized. Coeur's second act was different. He separated competence from exposure. He sold knowledge, not fleets. Insight, not inventory. He became valuable without becoming visible. This is an uncomfortable transition for those accustomed to status. It feels like disappearance. Spiritually, this aligns with the idea of humility after fracture. Not self-erasure, but recalibration. The ego, cracked by loss, must either harden defensively or soften intelligently. Coeur chose the latter. There are rumors, difficult to verify, that he advised the Papal States and assisted in crusading logistics in Cyprus. Even in diminished circumstances, his understanding of supply chains remained rare. He was useful because his mind had survived confiscation. This is the second financial lesson of his story. Skills compound independently of capital. When capital is taken, skills remain. When skills are neglected, capital eventually follows. Modern finance often reverses this priority. People chase assets before competence. They leverage before understanding. They build before learning how structures fail. Kerr learned this lesson through force rather than choice. Political risk is the shadow most investors prefer not to acknowledge. It feels distant, abstract, yet it has ended more fortunes than bad markets ever have. Governments change rules. Courts change loyalties. Protection dissolves when it is most needed. Kerr's fall is a reminder that wealth exists within systems that do not owe you continuity. This does not mean withdrawal from society. It means designing exposure consciously, spreading jurisdictional risk, avoiding total dependence on any single authority, maintaining optionality. Emotionally, this stage of recovery is the hardest. It requires releasing the desire to be seen as powerful, to accept that quiet competence outlasts visible dominance, that safety often looks like obscurity. Kerr never regained his fleet, but he regained something subtler: freedom from illusion. His later life lacked splendor, but it possessed proportion. He understood where he stood. He understood what could be taken and what could not. This clarity is rare among those who have only known ascent. As this chapter moves toward its conclusion, we will extract precise financial principles from his exile. How to think about jurisdiction, how to design portfolios and businesses that survive political shifts, how to recover without recreating centralized vulnerability. For now, let this settle. The merchant stands on a foreign shore, watching ships he no longer owns move across water he still understands. In the final years of Jacques Kerr's life, there was no dramatic return, no triumphant reclaiming of ships or titles. History does not offer him that comfort. What it offers instead is something quieter and more enduring: perspective. Kerr died knowing something few powerful men ever learn: that wealth, once broken, reveals its true architecture. His first fortune had been impressive, but it had rested on a narrow foundation: royal favor, centralized logistics, visibility mistaken for security. When that foundation cracked, everything above it collapsed at once. His second life was not an attempt to reverse that collapse. It was an acceptance of it. This acceptance is the gold poured into the fracture. Rather than rebuilding vertically, Kerr dispersed himself. He became difficult to seize because he was no longer concentrated. His value lived in his understanding of flows, not in ownership of vessels. He no longer needed permission to function. He had learned how systems move beneath appearances. This distinction matters deeply in financial recovery. Most people respond to ruin by trying to reclaim scale as quickly as possible. They believe size equals safety. But scale without resilience is merely a larger target. Kerr's exile taught him that smaller, distributed structures often endure longer than grand centralized ones. Politically, this lesson is ruthless but clear. Power does not tolerate rivals indefinitely. When your success begins to challenge authority, scrutiny follows. Rules are reinterpreted. Allegations emerge. Support evaporates. Those who survive are not the most visible, but the most adaptable. Financially, this translates into diversification beyond assets. It means jurisdictional awareness, understanding that laws, taxes, and protections are not neutral constants, but expressions of power. It means avoiding total dependence on a single system, employer, platform, or regulatory environment. It means designing your life so that no single decision by others can erase your functionality. Kerr's earlier wealth had made him indispensable. His later wisdom made him mobile. Mobility is an undervalued form of capital. When you can move, physically or strategically, you regain leverage. You can wait. You can choose. You can refuse. After loss, rebuilding mobility should precede rebuilding scale. Without it, any recovery is fragile. There is also a moral lesson embedded here, uncomfortable but necessary. Kerr's fall was not entirely unjust. His rise had benefited from proximity to power. He accepted its advantages without questioning its permanence. When the balance shifted, the same structure that elevated him destroyed him. Kintsugi does not deny responsibility. It integrates it. To heal financially, one must be honest not only about external forces, but about personal blind spots. Where did I confuse favor with stability? Where did I mistake growth for safety? Where did I allow convenience to replace caution? Kerr never wrote a philosophy, but his life teaches one. That wealth built without humility invites correction. That correction, though painful, can refine rather than annihilate. In the end, he was buried far from the centers he once dominated. But his legacy endures as a warning etched in gold. Not all loss comes from error. Some comes from structure. And structure can be changed. If your financial life has been shattered by forces beyond your control, Kerr's story offers both realism and relief. You may not recover what was taken. You may not return to your former position, but you can rebuild a life that functions under different rules. Kintsugi wealth is not restoration. It is transformation. The bowl does not return to its original shape. It becomes something else, something that carries memory visibly, honestly, without shame. The merchant who lost his fleet did not disappear. He adapted. He survived. And in doing so, he revealed a truth too often ignored, that the strongest fortunes are not those that never crack, but those that learn how to exist after power withdraws. The fire has moved on. The water is calmer now. The lesson remains. There is a cruel irony hidden in the life of Isaac Newton, one that history often softens out of politeness. The man who uncovered the invisible laws governing motion, gravity, and light could not govern himself when money entered the room. By the time Newton approached the South Sea Company, he was not a young man chasing fortune. He was already famous, already powerful, already secure in a way most people never become. He had rewritten humanity's understanding of the universe. Kings listened when he spoke. Scholars deferred. His mind had mapped the heavens. And yet, when speculation caught fire, Newton stepped into the blaze. London in the early 18th century was intoxicated by promise. The South Sea Company offered a vision that felt almost magical. Government debt transformed into future riches. Trade routes whispered but never shown. Numbers rising without visible effort. It was alchemy disguised as finance, and the city wanted to believe. At first, Newton watched from a distance. He invested cautiously, early, and wisely. When the shares rose, he sold. He made a substantial profit. Friends congratulated him. He could have stopped there. History would remember him as a man who understood limits. But then, something subtle happened. The price continued to rise. Others grew richer after he had exited. Conversations shifted. Doubt turned inward. The same mind that had calculated celestial mechanics began to calculate missed opportunity. Newton re-entered the market, not from ignorance, but from wounded pride. This is the crack. The philosopher who warned against passions became their hostage. The scientist who distrusted appearances trusted numbers stripped of substance. As the bubble expanded, Newton increased his exposure, chasing what he had already proven he could do without. When the collapse came, it was swift and merciless. Fortunes evaporated. The illusion dissolved. Newton lost an amount so large it embarrassed him into silence. He reportedly forbade anyone from mentioning the South Sea affair in his presence. The man who explained the cosmos could not explain his own behavior. Spiritually, this moment is devastating. Newton believed the universe was governed by laws. What he discovered too late was that the human mind contains forces just as powerful and far less predictable. Greed, envy, regret, the desire not to be left behind. These forces obey no equations. This is where Kintsugi enters the story. Newton's loss was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of self-awareness. His brilliance insulated him from humility. He believed mastery in one domain translated automatically to another. The crack exposed a truth few geniuses accept. Intelligence without emotional discipline is leverage against oneself. After the crash, Newton withdrew. He did not attempt revenge trades. He did not write defenses. He returned to study, to administration, to order. He accepted the loss quietly, though it scarred him deeply. There is no evidence he ever fully forgave himself. But something changed. He became more cautious in human affairs, more skeptical of collective enthusiasm, less impressed by numbers divorced from mechanism. The alchemist who once searched for hidden truths now understood that the most dangerous unknowns live inside the observer. This is the philosophical lesson beneath his fall. Wabi-sabi teaches that imperfection is not shameful. It is revealing. Newton's loss revealed the limits of reason when unaccompanied by emotional governance. It showed that the mind capable of brilliance is equally capable of self-deception. Financially, this lesson is lethal if ignored. Many investors believe that knowledge protects them, that analysis immunizes them, that intelligence is a shield. Newton's experience proves the opposite. Knowledge increases exposure if ego remains unexamined. Markets do not defeat people through complexity. They defeat them through simplicity. Through repeating the same emotional traps across centuries, waiting patiently for each generation to believe itself immune. Newton was not reckless. He was human. If you have ever re-entered a position because others were profiting after you exited, you have felt his pull. If you have ever overridden your own discipline because the market kept rising without you, you have stood where he stood. The first fracture in rebuilding wealth is not capital. It is trust in your own narrative. Newton trusted his intellect too much. The gold of Kintsugi would come later, in the form of restraint, humility, and silence. But the crack never disappeared. It remained a private reminder that even the clearest mind can be blinded by emotion. As this chapter continues, we will move deeper into the psychology behind Newton's mistake, and then into the financial structures that prevent brilliance from becoming vulnerability. For now, let this settle. A genius staring at numbers he once mastered, realizing too late that the most dangerous variable was never on the page. After the South Sea bubble collapsed, London returned to its routines with remarkable speed. Markets always do. They forget faster than individuals. The city absorbed the losses, reassigned blame, and moved on to the next preoccupation. Isaac Newton did not. He carried the loss inward. Those close to him noticed a hardening. Not bitterness, but caution sharpened into restraint. He spoke less in financial matters. He avoided speculative conversations. When markets were mentioned, he changed the subject or withdrew. The wound was not public. It was private, and therefore deeper. This is where the real transformation began. Newton's earlier life had been dominated by a belief in order. He believed that with sufficient intelligence, reality could be understood, predicted, and controlled. Gravity followed laws. Motion followed laws. Light followed laws. Why not markets? The bubble shattered that symmetry. Markets, he realized, are not governed by physical laws, but by human behavior. And human behavior is recursive. Emotion feeds on itself. Fear amplifies fear. Greed validates greed. Reason enters late, if at all. This realization did not make Newton cynical. It made him cautious of certainty. He began to distinguish between systems that respond to logic and systems that respond to belief. The South Sea Company had thrived not because of substance, but because of collective conviction. Numbers rose because people wanted them to rise. When belief broke, numbers obeyed instantly. Spiritually, this is the moment when the alchemist abandons the search for gold outside and begins to search inward. Wabi-sabi does not promise mastery over chaos. It asks for harmony with it. Newton's earlier intellectual posture sought domination. His later posture leaned toward accommodation. He accepted that some forces cannot be calculated away. They must be contained. This distinction is essential in financial recovery. Many people respond to loss by increasing analysis. More data, more indicators, more certainty. Newton's experience suggests the opposite. The failure was not lack of information. It was excess confidence in interpretation. He learned that the most important boundaries in investing are not technical. They are psychological. When emotion breaches discipline, intelligence becomes an accelerant rather than a brake. Newton's loss taught him restraint. He returned to administration at the Royal Mint, a role that demanded order rather than speculation. He focused on counterfeiting, standardization, stability. He chose systems where rules were enforced externally, not negotiated internally. This was not retreat. It was alignment. Financially, this translates into structure over discretion. Systems that limit behavior. Rules that prevent improvisation under pressure. Position sizing that cannot be overridden by emotion. Time delays that cool urgency. The broken alchemist learned that freedom without boundaries invites ruin. In markets, this means designing your strategy when you are calm and obeying it when you are not. It means deciding in advance how much you are willing to lose and refusing to renegotiate with yourself in moments of excitement or fear. Newton's genius had failed him because it trusted itself too much. His recovery came through constraint. This is uncomfortable for intelligent people. They want flexibility. They want nuance. They believe rules are for others. Markets punish this belief ruthlessly. The gold poured into Newton's crack was humility. He no longer believed brilliance guaranteed safety. He accepted that discipline must exist outside the mind, because the mind cannot be trusted under emotional stress. This insight, had it come earlier, might have saved his fortune. But it came when it was needed most. Kintsugi wealth does not erase the mistake. It integrates it. If you have lost money because you believed you were smarter than the market, you are not alone. You are in distinguished company. Newton's story is not meant to shame intelligence. It is meant to place it in context. Intelligence is a tool, like leverage, like speed. Without boundaries, it magnifies error. As this chapter moves toward its conclusion, we will translate this lesson into concrete financial behavior. How to build systems that protect you from yourself. How to respect emotion without obeying it. How to let humility become a source of strength rather than insecurity. For now, remain with this image. A man who understood the universe, realizing that the hardest system to govern was his own mind. In the final years of Isaac Newton's life, the fire that once drove him to conquer mysteries burned lower, steadier. He did not renounce his discoveries, but he no longer sought total mastery. Something in him had learned where certainty ends. He became careful with silence. Those who visited him late in life found a man less eager to impress, less inclined to argue. He listened more than he spoke. When the South Sea bubble was mentioned, his expression closed, not with anger, but with recognition. The wound had healed into a scar that guided his behavior. This is the last stage of Kintsugi. The crack does not disappear. It becomes functional. Newton never returned to speculation, not because he feared loss, but because he respected what loss had taught him. He had learned that markets are not laboratories. You cannot isolate variables. You cannot repeat conditions. You cannot remove the observer from the experiment. The mind is always in the equation. Financial recovery demands this same maturity. After loss, some people become reckless, seeking redemption through risk. Others become paralyzed, avoiding all exposure. Both responses are driven by emotion. Newton found a third path: constraint without fear, participation without illusion. He accepted that his advantage was not prediction, but discipline, that his strength lay not in foresight, but in self-restraint. This is an uncomfortable realization for those who value intellect above all else. But it is liberating. Markets do not reward the smartest participant. They reward the most self-aware. The financial application of Newton's lesson is precise. You do not need to outthink the market. You need to outlast your impulses. You design rules when calm. You automate where possible. You reduce the number of decisions you must make under stress. You assume that emotion will arrive, and you plan for it. This is how you pour gold into the crack. Risk limits become sacred. Position sizes remain small enough that fear does not dominate. Time horizons lengthen. You stop watching prices for entertainment. You treat investing as stewardship, not performance. Newton's mistake was not that he re-entered the market. It was that he allowed pride to override his earlier discipline. He violated his own rules because others were winning without him. This is the trap that never disappears. It only changes costumes. Kintsugi wealth does not claim immunity. It claims preparation. If you have experienced loss, you carry an advantage if you let it mature. You know how quickly conviction can dissolve. You know how persuasive crowds can become. You know how rationalization sneaks in disguised as logic. These memories are not burdens. They are reinforcements. Newton's genius gave the world equations that still hold. His failure gave us something just as valuable: a warning etched into history. That mastery of the external world does not guarantee mastery of the internal one. The broken alchemist became wiser not because he solved the market, but because he stopped trying to. This chapter closes with a quiet truth. Wealth built on control eventually meets what cannot be controlled. Wealth built on humility endures longer than intelligence alone ever could. The gold has set. The crack remains visible. And because of that, the structure holds. In the next chapter, we will turn to a figure whose wealth was never measured in coin alone. A poet and exile who lost everything visible and gained something that outlived empires. For now, rest in this. The most dangerous alchemy is believing you have transcended your own humanity. The night Dante Alighieri left Florence, there were no torches lighting his way, no procession marking the fall of a great man. Exile is rarely theatrical. It happens quietly, through decrees read aloud by others, through doors that no longer open, through streets that suddenly feel hostile. Dante departed carrying books, memories, and a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. He had been condemned in absentia, accused of corruption, fined sums he could not pay, threatened with death should he ever return. The city he loved had erased him without erasing his name. Florence, at the turn of the 14th century, was rich, restless, and divided. Banking families rose and fell with alarming speed. Politics were entangled with commerce, loyalty traded as readily as currency. Dante had believed he could navigate this world with integrity. He was wrong. This was the crack. Dante did not lose a fortune in the modern sense. He lost something more destabilizing: home, position, community. The financial consequences followed naturally. Without a base, income evaporates. Without belonging, protection vanishes. He became dependent on patrons who could withdraw support at any moment. Exile is a form of debt you never stop paying. For years, Dante wandered between courts and cities, relying on hospitality and modest stipends. He tasted humiliation daily. The poet who once debated politics now negotiated for shelter. His pride suffered more than his body. The longing for Florence never left him. Spiritually, this forced a reckoning. Dante realized that his earlier identity had been tied too tightly to a single place, a single role. When that was taken, he had nothing solid to stand on. The loss stripped him of illusion. He could either cling to bitterness or transform it. He chose transformation. In exile, Dante began to write not for recognition, but for coherence. He wrote to understand suffering, not to escape it. The Divine Comedy emerged not as a work of ambition, but as an act of survival. Each line mapped grief, rage, hope, and reconciliation with relentless honesty. This is where Kintsugi becomes visible. Wabi-sabi honors the beauty of what has been weathered. Dante's work carries the marks of exile openly. Hell is not abstract. It is personal. Purgatory is not symbolic. It is process. Paradise is not triumph. It is clarity earned through endurance. Financially, Dante's story speaks to those whose losses are not purely numerical. When income collapses alongside reputation, rebuilding requires something deeper than strategy. It requires narrative, a way to integrate loss into identity without being consumed by it. Dante's exile compressed his life. Excess fell away. What remained was voice, perspective, discipline. He wrote under constraints that would have broken lesser spirits. And because of those constraints, his work gained density. This is the first lesson for financial recovery after social or reputational ruin. When structure collapses, scale must wait. First comes meaning. Without it, any attempt to rebuild wealth feels hollow and unstable. You need to know who you are without applause. Dante's wealth, in exile, was not money. It was time spent thinking clearly under pressure. It was discipline maintained without reward. It was the refusal to surrender dignity when circumstance invited despair. In markets and careers alike, exile can take many forms: bankruptcy, public failure, loss of credibility, being forced out of a system you once believed in. These events feel final. Dante's life proves they are not. But they are irreversible. You do not return to the same Florence. You become someone capable of building elsewhere. As this chapter continues, we will explore how Dante transformed loss into lasting value and how financial recovery often depends on the same willingness to endure obscurity while forging depth. For now, sit with this image: a man walking away from his city, knowing he may never return, carrying within him a work that will outlive every stone he leaves behind. Exile teaches patience in ways success never can. Dante learned this slowly, painfully, through seasons measured not by achievement, but by endurance. Each court he visited offered temporary refuge, conditional favor. He ate at tables where he was welcome only as long as he remained useful, agreeable, quiet. He wrote that nothing is more bitter than knowing the taste of another man's bread and the climb of another man's stairs. This was not metaphor. It was daily life. And yet, something extraordinary happened during these years of dependency. Dante's thinking deepened. Stripped of political ambition and local rivalry, he began to see patterns larger than Florence. Power, he realized, always demands allegiance before it offers protection. When allegiance fractures, protection vanishes instantly. This recognition reshaped his inner architecture. Spiritually, exile forced Dante to confront impermanence without illusion. Home, status, income, reputation all proved conditional. What endured was attention, the capacity to observe, the discipline to continue working without external validation. Wabi-sabi lives here, in the acceptance that beauty emerges not from control, but from weathering. Dante's writing during exile did not seek comfort. It sought truth. He cataloged human weakness with unsparing clarity. Pride, envy, greed, betrayal. He recognized them not as abstract sins, but as lived forces that shape destinies and dissolve fortunes. Financially, this insight is devastatingly practical. Many financial failures are not technical. They are moral in the classical sense, not about virtue signaling, but about unmanaged drives, the desire for status, the fear of exclusion, the hunger to belong to winning sides. Dante saw how these forces distort judgment long before markets ever existed. His exile allowed him to watch these dynamics from the outside. When he described souls trapped in cycles of punishment, he was not fantasizing about divine justice. He was describing feedback loops, patterns where behavior creates consequence, which reinforces behavior, until escape requires fundamental change. This mirrors financial collapse precisely. Debt, once taken lightly, becomes obligation. Obligation becomes pressure. Pressure distorts decision-making. Distortion deepens debt. Without intervention, the cycle tightens. Dante understood this not through theory, but through lived dependence. Yet, he did not seek shortcuts. Patrons occasionally offered him paths back to Florence through compromise, renunciations, public apologies, statements that would allow him to return under humiliating conditions. Dante refused. He wrote that he would not re-enter his city by a path that compromised his dignity. This decision mattered. Financial recovery often presents similar temptations. Opportunities to regain income quickly by sacrificing long-term integrity. Deals that solve immediate pressure while planting future instability. Dante chose slower poverty over compromised return. This is where most people break. It is easier to accept bad terms than to sit with uncertainty. easier to trade autonomy for relief. Dante's refusal preserved something more valuable than money: self-trust. Without self-trust, no recovery holds. Spiritually, this is the gold poured into the crack. The loss teaches boundaries. What you will not do, even when desperate. These boundaries become structural reinforcements. Dante's work gained strength precisely because he did not rush reconciliation. The Divine Comedy required years of solitude, revision, and suffering. It could not have been written under comfortable patronage alone. Its power lies in compression, in the weight of lived consequence. Financially, this suggests something counterintuitive. After loss, speed is rarely your ally. Pressure tempts urgency. Urgency tempts compromise. Compromise plants future fractures. Slow recovery preserves alignment. Dante accepted dependence without surrendering agency. He took support without relinquishing authorship. He allowed circumstance to shape him without letting it own him. This balance is rare. If you are rebuilding after debt or exile of any kind, Dante's path offers guidance. Accept help without attachment. Take time without drifting. Work without applause. Protect dignity even when it seems impractical, because what you are rebuilding is not just income. It is narrative coherence. Without that, wealth remains unstable. As this chapter moves toward its conclusion, we will see how Dante's return was not geographic, but symbolic. How legacy replaced location. How depth outlasted displacement. For now, let the image rest. A man climbing unfamiliar stairs again and again, carrying a manuscript that grows heavier with meaning each year. Dante never returned to Florence. Not in life. Not in triumph. The city that expelled him remained closed, stubborn, unmoved by the magnitude of what it had lost. This is an ending many stories avoid, because it denies the comfort of symmetry. But this is where the deeper return occurs. As Dante aged, exile ceased to feel like punishment and began to feel like distance. Distance sharpens vision. From afar, Florence shrank from a wound into a symbol. It became one city among many, one structure among countless structures that rise, exclude, and decay. Dante no longer needed to be inside it to understand it. The Divine Comedy reached completion not as a cry for redemption, but as an architecture of meaning. Hell, purgatory, and paradise were not places. They were states of being, ways of relating to power, desire, guilt, hope. Dante had turned personal loss into a universal map. This is the final stage of Kintsugi wealth. The crack no longer defines the object. It defines its purpose. Dante's earlier life had sought influence. His later life produced legacy. Influence depends on proximity to power. Legacy depends on depth of insight. One is fragile. The other compounds across centuries. Financially, this distinction matters more than most people realize. After ruin, many aim to return to their previous position. Same industry, same social tier, same markers of success. Dante shows another path. When return is impossible, transcendence becomes available. Transcendence does not mean abstraction. It means moving to a level where former losses no longer limit contribution. Dante died in Ravenna, far from the city that defined his youth. He died with modest means. No estate, no restored title. And yet, his work reshaped language, theology, and imagination across Europe. Florence eventually begged to reclaim his remains. It was too late. This reversal is not poetic coincidence. It is structural. Wealth tied to location, institution, or favor is vulnerable to exile. Wealth tied to meaning is portable. It follows the creator, not the city. In modern terms, this is reputation capital refined by suffering, the kind that cannot be revoked by decree or erased by scandal. It grows slowly, invisibly, until time itself becomes its ally. Dante's financial life never recovered in the conventional sense, but his economic relevance multiplied beyond anything Florence could have offered him. His work generated value long after his death. Influence became intergenerational. This is not consolation. It is instruction. If your financial collapse has removed you from systems you once depended on, you are not necessarily diminished. You are repositioned. The question is whether you rebuild toward proximity again or toward durability. Durability requires depth. Depth requires time. Time requires patience without guarantees. Dante had no certainty his work would survive. He wrote anyway. He revised anyway. He refined anyway. This discipline under uncertainty is the same discipline that underlies the strongest long-term financial recoveries. You continue working even when the outcome is unclear. You invest in quality rather than speed. You build assets that do not depend on applause. The world rarely rewards this immediately. That is why so few attempt it. Kintsugi wealth is not the wealth of return. It is the wealth of transformation. The bowl is never the same, but it becomes something that endures handling, travel, time. Dante's exile carved gold into his fracture, not because suffering is noble, but because he did not waste it. He let it reorganize his values. He allowed loss to strip ambition down to essence. What remained was voice. In financial life, voice is clarity of strategy. The ability to articulate why you do what you do, why you wait, why you refuse certain gains, why you accept certain constraints. Without voice, rebuilding becomes imitation. With voice, it becomes authorship. Dante became the author of his fate precisely because fate denied him permission. The forge was never silent. Even before the hammer struck, there was the breath of fire, the low animal sound of heat consuming air. Iron waited there, dark and inert, unaware of what pressure would demand of it. In a small workshop far from courts and markets, Masamune began his work long before dawn, as he had for decades. He did not rush. Japanese legends speak of Masamune as the greatest swordsmith who ever lived, but legends often miss the essence. They speak of beauty, of blades so refined they seemed alive. What they rarely describe is the monotony, the repetition, the thousands of strikes that left no visible mark, only microscopic changes in structure. Masamune folded steel again and again, not to impress, but to endure. Each fold was a compromise. The metal was heated until it glowed, hammered until it flattened, folded back into itself, and reheated. Impurities were forced out slowly. Stress lines redistributed. Weakness was not denied. It was managed. This is where the crack becomes intentional. Unlike swords forged quickly for war, Masamune's blades carried visible patterns, layers revealed by polish, lines that told the story of pressure endured. These were not flaws. They were records. In the era Masamune lived, Japan was unstable. Power shifted constantly. Lords rose and fell. Loyalty changed hands. Many craftsmen chased patrons aggressively, adapting style to fashion, seeking rapid favor. Masamune did not. He worked quietly. He let his blades speak long after he did. Spiritually, this reflects the deepest expression of wabi-sabi. Beauty is not the absence of strain. It is the harmony that emerges from it. The sword does not pretend it was never stressed. It displays the evidence with dignity. Masamune understood something markets would rediscover centuries later. Strength that matters is slow to form and slow to fail. Financially, this is uncomfortable wisdom. Modern wealth culture celebrates speed, fast growth, rapid scaling, immediate validation. But structures built too quickly retain internal stress. They look flawless until pressure reveals brittleness. When they break completely. Masamune's process was the opposite. He invited stress early, repeatedly, in controlled amounts. Each cycle made the blade more resilient. Each reheating redistributed tension. The final product could flex under impact without shattering. This is the philosophy beneath durable wealth. You do not avoid drawdowns. You manage them. You do not demand uninterrupted growth. You design for interruption. You allow volatility to test your structure while you are still small enough to adapt. Masamune did not know if a blade would ever see battle. Many never did. But he forged them as if they would face the worst. This mindset distinguishes craftsmen from speculators. Speculators build for favorable conditions. Craftsmen build for adversity. In finance, this means portfolios designed to survive stress rather than maximize appearance. It means accepting periods of stagnation. It means tolerating underperformance relative to hype. It means choosing businesses, assets, and strategies that can endure boredom as well as fear. Masamune's blades were not cheap. They required time, material, patience, and restraint. This limited volume. He could not scale quickly, even if he wanted to. His wealth grew slowly, proportionate to mastery, not demand. This is another uncomfortable truth. Compounding that endures often looks disappointing in its early stages. It does not excite crowds. It does not attract imitators. But it accumulates something far more valuable than speed. Integrity. Integrity in finance means alignment between risk, expectation, and behavior. When these diverge, Cracks widen invisibly. When they align, stress reinforces rather than destroys. Masamune did not decorate weakness. He refined it. Each flaw addressed made the blade quieter, stronger, more honest. This is Kintsugi without gold. The repair is internal. The memory of stress becomes structure. The blade remembers what it survived. As this chapter continues, we will move deeper into Masamune's philosophy of patience and how it applies directly to long-term investing, drawdowns, and compounding under uncertainty. For now, hold this image. A craftsman striking steel not to conquer time, but to collaborate with it. Masamune believed that the forge was a place of listening, not domination. He watched the color of the steel more closely than the calendar. He waited for the metal to tell him when it was ready to be struck, when it needed rest, when it would crack if pushed too far. Impatience ruined more blades than ignorance ever did. This patience was not passive. It was attentive. He understood that every material has limits, and that exceeding those limits too often, even in pursuit of excellence, leads to failure. The steel could endure tremendous stress, but only if it was allowed to cool, to settle, to reorganize internally. Heat without rest created brittleness. Force without rhythm destroyed structure. This rhythm is the missing element in most approaches to wealth. People understand effort. They understand ambition. What they rarely understand is recovery. Markets, like steel, require cycles of heat and cooling. Periods of growth followed by consolidation. Expansion followed by restraint. When these rhythms are ignored, systems break. Masamune's blades were never rushed to completion. He accepted that mastery unfolds on its own schedule. This acceptance did not slow him. It protected him. Financially, this translates into respecting cycles rather than resisting them. Drawdowns are cooling periods. They are not interruptions to be avoided at all costs. They are structural necessities. Without them, excess builds unnoticed. Risk concentrates. Fragility increases. The craftsman does not panic when the blade cools. He does not mistake stillness for failure. He waits, knowing the next heating will be more effective because the structure has settled. In investing, this patience appears as the ability to hold through discomfort without freezing into inaction or thrashing into overreaction. It is the discipline to rebalance rather than abandon, to observe rather than dramatize. Masamune also understood asymmetry. Not every strike mattered equally. Some blows reshaped the blade dramatically. Others simply reinforced what was already there. He did not count strikes. He counted impact. This awareness separated meaningful work from noise. This is a profound financial lesson. Most activity in markets is noise. Daily price movements, headlines, predictions. Reacting to all of it exhausts attention and weakens judgment. The craftsman learns to distinguish structural changes from surface vibration. Long-term wealth is built by a few decisive actions taken at the right moments, not by constant motion. Knowing when to act matters more than acting often. Masamune's restraint extended beyond technique. He lived modestly. He did not chase patrons aggressively. He did not scale production to satisfy demand. This limited his short-term wealth, but preserved his autonomy. He answered to the work, not to the market. Autonomy is a form of capital. When your survival depends on constant output, you are forced into compromises. You accept inferior materials. You cut corners. You rationalize weakness. Over time, the structure degrades. In financial life, overdependence on returns creates similar pressure. You take risks you should not take because you need the money now. You abandon discipline because patience feels unaffordable. This is how fragile portfolios are born. Masamune's life reminds us that sustainability precedes prosperity. You must be able to continue before you can compound. There is also humility in his process. Despite his reputation, Masamune never claimed perfection. He understood that every blade carried uncertainty. Hidden flaws could exist. No process eliminated risk entirely. This awareness kept him vigilant. In finance, humility preserves capital. Overconfidence invites exposure. When you believe your strategy is flawless, you stop protecting against tail risk. When you assume uncertainty remains, you design buffers. The quiet craftsman never believed he had finished learning. Each blade taught him something new. Each failure informed the next attempt. Kintsugi wealth embodies this posture. Loss is not erased. It becomes instruction. Drawdowns are not denied. They are integrated. As this chapter moves forward, we will translate Masamune's craftsmanship into precise financial behavior. How to design portfolios that absorb stress. How to treat volatility as feedback rather than threat. How to allow time, not speed, to do the heavy lifting. For now, remain by the forge. Listen to the rhythm of hammer and heat. Wealth, like steel, becomes strong not by avoiding pressure, but by respecting its tempo. When Masamune finished a blade, he did not celebrate. He inspected it. Slowly, patiently, he tested its balance, its flexibility, its response under strain. Only when it met standards that had nothing to do with fashion or demand did he let it leave his hands. This final restraint is the hardest discipline to learn. Most people mistake completion for success. Masamune knew that completion was only the beginning of exposure. A blade's true test came later, in conditions he would never witness. His responsibility was not to ensure perfection, but to ensure survivability. This mindset translates directly into long-term wealth. You do not build a portfolio to impress in favorable conditions. You build it to endure conditions you cannot predict. You assume that stress will arrive unannounced, and you prepare quietly, without applause. Masamune's blades were known not only for sharpness, but for mercy. There are legends that contrast his swords with those of Muramasa, blades said to thirst for blood. Masamune's swords, by contrast, were said to allow leaves to drift past unharmed while cutting only what was necessary. Myth exaggerates, but the symbolism matters. The strongest tools are precise, not aggressive. Financial aggression often looks powerful, but it leaves no margin for error. Precision, on the other hand, preserves capital. You take risk deliberately. You limit exposure. You cut where needed and allow what does not matter to pass untouched. This is the gold that settles into the crack. After loss, many become reactive. They swing too hard, trying to compensate for what was taken. Masamune's discipline teaches restraint after stress. Not fear, but calibration. Calibration requires feedback. Every drawdown, every underperformance, every missed opportunity contains information. The craftsman studies it without drama. He asks what was structural and what was noise. He adjusts without abandoning the core. In financial recovery, this approach prevents both recklessness and paralysis. You neither double down blindly nor retreat permanently. You refine. Masamune accepted that no blade was eternal. Steel wears. Edges dull. Maintenance is continuous. This acceptance freed him from perfectionism. Wealth is the same. Portfolios require maintenance, rebalancing, risk review, periodic restraint. There is no final configuration that guarantees safety forever. Those who search for one invite fragility. Kintsugi wealth does not seek immortality. It seeks longevity. Longevity is built through humility, patience, and respect for time. Masamune's life embodied all three. He worked quietly. He allowed reputation to travel without chasing it. He let the quality of his work speak across generations. Financially, this means building systems that function without constant supervision, automating discipline, reducing decision fatigue, creating structures that do not rely on emotional presence to survive. When Masamune died, his blades remained. They outlived wars, dynasties, and names. They endured because they had been forged with an understanding of stress, not a denial of it. This is the culmination of Kintsugi wealth within craftsmanship. The crack is no longer a flaw. It is a feature. Evidence that pressure was expected, planned for, integrated. The object holds because it remembers what it survived. As we leave the forge, carry this with you. Wealth that demands perfection will fail you. Wealth that anticipates strain will serve you. In the end, the fire grows low, not because the work is finished, but because it has settled into something quieter. The bowl rests on the table now, its cracks filled, not hidden. Light touches the gold gently, not loudly. Nothing about it asks for attention. And yet, it holds it. This is the wealth most people never learn to build. They chase shine. They chase speed. They chase the illusion that if something looks intact, it must be strong. History, again and again, tells a different story. The things that endure are not those that avoided damage, but those that learned how to carry it. Every figure we have walked with understood this, whether they wanted to or not. Morgan learned that authority born in calm dissolves in panic, but authority forged in collapse steadies others. Musashi learned that tools are optional, but discipline is not. Marcus Aurelius learned that power does not shield you from loss, It only magnifies its consequences. Jacques Coeur learned that favor is not a foundation. Newton learned that brilliance without restraint becomes self-destructive. Dante learned that exile can compress a life into meaning. Masamune learned that stress, applied correctly, becomes strength. Different centuries, different worlds, the same truth. Wealth that cannot be dropped is not wealth. It is decoration. Real wealth survives handling. It survives being set down carelessly. It survives being tested by time, by fear, by boredom, by pressure. It does not demand perfect conditions. It assumes imperfection and plans accordingly. This is the essence of Kintsugi. Not the gold itself, but the decision to repair honestly rather than pretend. Not the restoration of the old form, but the creation of a truer one. If your financial life has never cracked, it will. If it has cracked already, you are not behind. You are earlier in a different cycle. The only failure is refusing to learn what the break revealed. Design your wealth so that it does not depend on constant confidence. Build liquidity not as laziness, but as space. Build skill not as pride, but as portability. Build patience not as virtue signaling, but as survival. Let your scars remain visible to you, even if no one else sees them. They are not shame. They are reinforcement. The bowl on the table is heavier now, not with gold, but with memory. It does not need to be admired. It needs to hold. In the final section, we will slow everything down. The voice will soften. The ideas will repeat, gently, deliberately, not to teach, but to settle. To let the gold set where the mind resists it most. Settle where you are. Nothing needs to be achieved now. Nothing needs to be proven. Imagine the fire again. It is smaller than before. Not weak, just calm. The kind of fire that no longer flares, only breathes. Each flame rises and falls slowly, as if it has learned patience from watching the night. With every breath you take, the room grows quieter. You have walked through stories of collapse, exile, discipline, and return. You do not need to remember every detail. Your mind will keep what matters. The rest can dissolve gently, like smoke rising and thinning into dark air. Think of the bowl, not as an object, but as a presence. It has been broken before. It has been held together again, not perfectly, honestly. The cracks are visible, but they no longer threaten the form. They support it. Let that image rest behind your eyes. Loss does not mean failure. Loss means contact with reality. Reality teaches slowly, but it teaches deeply. You do not need to rush away from what you have lost. You do not need to relive it either. It has already done its work. Each experience that hurt you left information behind. Each mistake carved awareness into you. Each disappointment trained you to see more clearly. You are not rebuilding the past. You are reinforcing the future. Breathe in and breathe out. With every exhale, allow urgency to soften. The world does not need your reaction tonight. Markets are closed. Decisions are asleep. Even fear is tired. Time is longer than it feels. Wealth that endures is slow. It waits. It listens. It does not beg the moment to be different. Your nervous system is learning this now. You do not need perfect conditions to be safe. You do not need constant certainty to be stable. You only need structure that expects imperfection. Let that sentence sink deeper. Structure that expects imperfection. That is where peace lives. Think of everything you once believed had to go right for you to be okay. Notice how much lighter it feels to release that belief. Notice how the body responds when pressure loosens. You are allowed to move at the speed of repair. You are allowed to rest between cycles. You are allowed to grow without noise. Nothing valuable is rushed. The gold does not harden instantly. It sets slowly, settling into the cracks, filling them fully only when left undisturbed. So tonight, you do not disturb it. You let it set. Your mind does not need to solve anything now. Your future does not need to arrive tonight. Your worth does not depend on what happens next. You have already survived enough to trust yourself. Breathe again. Feel the weight of the day fall away. Feel the long arc of time stretch far beyond tomorrow. Feel how small this moment is, and how safe that makes it. The bowl can be lifted. The bowl can be set down. The bowl will hold, and so will you. Stay here a little longer. There is no destination now, only settling. The fire has become embers. They glow without effort. They give warmth without demand. This is how stability feels. Not excitement. Not intensity. Just quiet continuity. Bring your attention back to the bowl once more. It does not remember the moment it broke with pain. It remembers the patience of repair. The steady hands, the time allowed. Your life has known both fracture and waiting. Waiting is not emptiness. Waiting is integration. Every lesson you could not absorb while moving fast is finding its place now. Every insight that felt too heavy before is settling into something usable. You do not need to analyze it. Analysis keeps the mind awake. Understanding arrives when effort leaves. Let effort leave. Loss did not weaken you. It slowed you enough to notice. Notice how the body rests when it no longer needs to perform. Notice how breathing deepens when nothing is required. Notice how thoughts become softer when you stop following them. You are not behind. You are not late. You are exactly where repair happens. Wealth that endures is not loud. It does not argue with time. It does not fight gravity. It accepts weight. You have learned to carry weight. That is why the future will not crush you. It will rest on you. Repeat this gently inside, without force. I do not need perfection. I need resilience. Again, I do not need perfection. I need resilience. Feel how that truth lands differently in the body. less pressure in the chest, less tension in the jaw, more space behind the eyes. The nervous system understands when it is safe to stop striving. Safety does not come from certainty. It comes from capacity. You have capacity now. Capacity to wait. Capacity to choose less. Capacity to endure boredom without panicking. Capacity to endure fear without obeying it. These capacities are invisible to others. That is why they last. Think of time not as something chasing you, but as something walking beside you. It does not rush. It does not judge. It simply continues. And you continue with it. Every cycle you survived trained you for the next one. Every disappointment removed something unnecessary. Every pause strengthened something essential.